This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history. Episode 22, God Has No Country. Shortly after 8 a.m., a sleek black sedan glided down the Via della Conciliazione toward St. Peter's Basilica. It halted at the white line marking the boundary between the neutral Vatican territory and Nazi-occupied Rome. When the car stopped, Colonel Herbert Kappler stepped out into the cool morning air, his sharp eyes surveying the towering basilica with disdain. Two plainclothes men followed him out, and Kappler gestured toward the left corner of the basilica steps. There a tall figure stood partly concealed in shadow, wearing a low-crowned black hat, and a long black robe that draped over his athletic form. From over 300 yards away, his face was indistinct, but the sunlight caught his glasses as he glanced up from the devotional book in his hands to observe the arrivals. "That is he," Kappler said to the Gestapo men, his voice low and cold. "Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, a mad Irish priest, but dangerous, too dangerous to live. He has given us more trouble than any other in Rome, and it must stop. He knows he will be arrested if we catch him outside of Vatican territory, and we have so far failed to lure him across that line, or spot him when he has slipped away into the city, which he does whenever he feels like it. Since we can't take him frontally, we shall try from the rear." Kappler leaned closer, his tone grim. "He does not know you. You have never been on duty here before?" The men exchanged glances and shook their heads. "No? That's good. Tomorrow you will attend service in St. Peter's. It is a feast day of some sort, so there will be plenty of people. As they start to come out, you will come out also. But use the door immediately behind where O'Flaherty stands now. Seize him. Hustle him down the steps and across that line. When you get him away and into a side street, free him. For a moment. I don't want to see him alive again, and we certainly don't want any formal trials. He will have been shot while escaping. Understand?" Hugh shuffled around the stack of papers spread on the desk in front of him, pushing his cheap, steel-rimmed spectacles higher on the bridge of his nose, as he slowly made his way through the stack of correspondence and reports that fell under his charge. His duties at the Holy Office could be complicated at times, but they still paled in comparison to his clandestine activities. The door suddenly burst open, and in rushed John May, the British legation's accountant, and one of Hugh's most reliable allies. It was the manservant's financial skills that had been instrumental in keeping their rescue network afloat. Flushed and anxious, John shut the door firmly behind him. "Monsignor," he began urgently, "a little problem has come up. You know our friend Giuseppe, our contact in the Questura. Well, he's just told me that Kappler has some amiable plans to kidnap you tomorrow. I don't know exactly how, but I think you'd better stay off the steps for a day or two." Hugh stood, his imposing 6'2" frame towering over the smaller man. Despite being in his 40s, Hugh had retained the powerful build that came from a lifelong love of sports. He simply laughed, brushing off John's warning. Kappler was truly getting desperate now if he thought a kidnapping scheme was a clever plan. Hugh folded his arms across his chest. "What, me boy, and let them think I'm afraid? So long as they don't use guns, I can tackle any 2 or 3 of them with ease. Though a scrap would be a bit undignified on the very steps of St. Peter itself, would it not?" John coughed politely. "Monsignor," he said, "you have a point. If the Nazis can't try this on one day, they'll have a go another time. And perhaps we won't get warning on that occasion. Giuseppe can't be expected to get to know everything always. I think Kappler needs a lesson. If you would leave it to me, Monsignor." "I don't want to know anything about your plans, John," Hugh said with a grin. "But I will be there in the morning just as usual." The next day, standing to conduct Mass from one of the 44 altars in the Grand Basilica, he spotted John among the crowd, accompanied by Giuseppe, their invaluable Roman tram driver turned informant. It was an interesting backdrop for an assassination attempt. the whispered prayers of priests mixed with the tinkling of women's heels along the marble floor, and Michelangelo's masterpiece, La Pieta, standing beautifully next to the main doors. Hugh noted Giuseppe discreetly pointing out two plainclothes men, their heads bowed in feigned reverence. John immediately signaled to 4 Swiss guards, who moved swiftly and silently toward the Germans. With a firm tap on the shoulder and a curt gesture, the guards escorted the officers to their feet. Flanked by guards on all sides, the 2 men had no choice but to comply. The officers were escorted out the door behind O'Flaherty, the same door they'd intended to exit with their prisoner. However, they left disappointed, forced to endure a shameful exit right past their target, who gallantly stood aside to let them pass, his blue eyes dancing merrily behind his glasses. It was the 2 German officers, rather than O'Flaherty, who afterwards found themselves hustled down a side street by Yugoslavians, whom John had organized as a personal welcome committee. It was a very battered and bruised pair that returned to report yet another failure to the fuming Kappler. The elusive Irish priest had evaded them once again. When Adam and Eve initially left the Garden of Eden, there must have been endless discomforts and pains that quickly became a part of their reality. Hunger and thirst probably came right away, along with illnesses and unfavorable weather conditions. But then at some point, they must have been introduced to the more insidious, emotional pains that are inherent to this mortal condition. Things like fear, guilt, and grief. But I would guess that if you asked Adam and Eve what they consider to be the most painful thing that they experienced in their lifetimes, it would probably center on one experience in particular, the one involving their 2 sons. Surely Adam and Eve loved their sons and wanted the best for them. Growing up, I imagine that Cain and Abel probably squabbled as boys do, but Cain's hatred became so intense that he ended up killing his own brother. It's the first recorded act of violence in history. Just imagine how that must have rent Adam and Eve's souls. It's one thing to have something tragic happen to your child, but an entirely different experience to have it done by the hand of another child who you also love. Little did they know that this was merely the first of countless atrocities that their children would commit against each other down through the ages. After the destructive toll of World War I, Germany faced significant political, economic, and social upheaval. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, and pay massive reparations to the Allied nations, which severely strained its economy. Inflation made German money practically useless, and public poverty took a dramatic rise. The German Empire collapsed, and the democratic government that replaced it received a lot of criticism from all sides. Germany was veritably reeling and ripe for extremist ideologies. The up-and-coming Nazi Party fed on the public anger and used it as a way to catapult themselves into power, with their promise to restore Germany to its rightful glory. Extreme devotion to concentrated government like this is called fascism. Now, just to clarify, because fascism is often a loosely used term today, fascism comes from the extreme right side of politics. It plays on nationalism and unity, insisting that centralized power is the only way to maintain order. Interestingly, fascism is very anti-communist. The Nazis were very anti-communist, and that's because fascism and communism are on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. Socialism is similar to communism. Really, it's a softer form of communism, but they operate on essentially the same principles. Communism is a leftist political ideology that's all about creating equality by collective ownership, which essentially is no ownership because no one really owns anything. The point I'm trying to make with this is that it's dangerous to become extreme on either end of the spectrum. Italy also fell prey to the same fascist regimes that were taking hold in Germany, and for many of the same reasons. Italy came away from the First World War deeply scarred and massively in debt, which led to high unemployment rates and inflation. Although Italy fought on the winning side of World War I with the Allies, they felt cheated in the post-war settlement, especially considering their massive human cost. They lost about 650,000 soldiers, not to mention over 600,000 others who were taken as prisoners of war or went missing, along with over 1 million others wounded. Italy came away having sacrificed so much, and with very little to show for it, other than a few territorial gains, and not as many as they'd been promised in the treaty. So again, this proved fertile soil for someone like Benito Mussolini, who came along promising to save the people in their time of crisis. His was a decisive and strong voice in a time of great uncertainty for the Italian people. His vision was to restore the glory and power of early Rome, and by using violence to suppress his political enemies and propaganda to win the hearts of the people, he quickly rose to power. He justified the need for invading other countries by claiming that the Italian resources and land weren't sufficient for their growing state. Sharing similar ideologies, Germany and Italy were the first to come together and create a political alliance called the Pact of Steel in 1939, which gave birth to the Axis powers. About 4 months later, Germany invaded Poland, signaling the beginning of the Second World War. But things quickly turned sour for Mussolini. Military failures and the widespread discontent of the people lost him his support, and a plot came underway to remove him from his position as prime minister. Despite Mussolini's power, Italy was still technically a constitutional monarchy, and while the king had initially allowed Mussolini to take control, partly to keep a civil war from breaking out, he and a fascist Grand Council had Mussolini dismissed and arrested. Italy was beginning to wonder if they stood on the wrong side of this war, and after they issued an armistice with the Allies, Hitler, worrying that this temporary truce might lead to a future alliance between Italy and the Allies, ordered an invasion of the country that had once been on his side. And because Italy now didn't really have a stance in the war, thousands of POWs began pouring from prisoner of war camps, mostly because the Italians no longer considered themselves part of the Axis powers, and they didn't want to hold Allied prisoners anymore. But when the Germans came in, they guarded the borders and began making serious concerted efforts to round back up these prisoners. The German occupation was brutal. They exploited Italian resources and met any resistance with harsh retribution. Jews were being deported to concentration camps, and the future looked very bleak. This, my friends, is where our hero makes his entrance. Early on, Mussolini had made a treaty with the Vatican City, agreeing that as the spiritual and administrative center of the Catholic Church, it would act as its own neutral and independent city-state. When the Germans began their occupation, they too had to honor this agreement, or risk inflaming conflict by violating the Vatican's sovereign and neutral status. This odd phenomena of neutrality in the midst of all this fighting proved a critical refuge for a man who time and time again would risk his own life to save others. His name was Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an unlikely hero whose bravery knew no bounds. The narrow stone-lined hallways of the German Teutonic College stretched endlessly, exuding a solemn, reverent atmosphere. Hugh's measured steps echoed faintly against the smooth stone floors, worn by centuries of passing feet. Sunlight filtered softly through tall, narrow windows set high on the walls, mingling with the warm glow from wrought iron sconces lining the corridor. Hugh moved with purpose as he silently tallied the growing number of prisoners of war under his care. Their numbers swelled daily, even as resources dwindled. The Italian surrender on September 3rd and the subsequent military truce had unleashed a torrent of Italian POWs, fleeing camps where their former captors no longer wished to hold them. While many sought refuge in the countryside, others poured into Rome, hoping to blend into the bustling city. Though technically from a neutral country and under protection of the neutral Vatican, Hugh had not been able to turn away anyone that came to him. Secretly, Hugh had relied on friends and acquaintances to help him hide the escapees, but their resources were strained to the breaking point. As he exited the college and approached the looming Hospice Santa Maria, Hugh reminded himself why he was doing this. Yet climbing to the 4th floor, he couldn't help but marvel at the irony of his next step. He hesitated momentarily before knocking on the door, shaking his head at the unlikely alliance that he was about to pursue. His relationship with Sir Darcy Osborne, the British minister to the Vatican, had been minimal, aside from a tentative friendship born out of a shared love of golf. But Hugh's deep-seated resentment of the British, forged in the fires of his Irish upbringing, had been hard to overcome. The brutal history of British oppression in Ireland lingered vividly in his memory. As a schoolboy in Limerick, Hugh had witnessed his country's struggle for independence against British rule. He still recalled the daily news of men and women slaughtered, some for resisting, others for no reason at all. But this was not the time to dwell on the past, he reminded himself. This was about the present, about doing what was right, no matter the divisions of nationality or history. With that resolve, he rapped firmly on the door. The man who answered was short, with a thick Cockney accent, and he ushered Hugh into the room. Seated across from Sir Darcy Osborne, Hugh noted how starkly different they were. Darcy embodied the refined, aristocratic air of an old-school diplomat, suave and impeccably dressed and reserved. Hugh, by contrast, wore his simple black cassock, a testament to his humble rural roots, and preference for practicality over vanity. His larger-than-life personality might shine in other circumstances, but here he kept it subdued. Hugh began explaining the dire situation, the influx of British prisoners of war into Rome, the dwindling resources, and the looming threat of winter. "I'm sorry, but there's simply nothing I can do," Darcy said, his words cool and measured. The warmth in Hugh's eyes evaporated instantly. "I sympathize, of course," the diplomat continued, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "But I dare not jeopardize my position here in the neutral Vatican state." Hugh straightened in his chair, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "But something has to be done," he insisted. "With winter approaching, many will fall ill or die without shelter. If they surrender, they'll face German prison camps with conditions even worse than before. Surely you don't expect men with the courage and resourcefulness to escape to simply return to their captors." Darcy's faint, weary smile did little to soothe Hugh's frustration. "I understand you've been helping these men yourself, even using your own funds. I can offer you some personal assistance, discreetly, of course, but I cannot use official resources. My position is precarious as it is. What I suggest is that you speak with John May." He gestured toward the butler who had let Hugh in. "I don't want to know the details, but I trust he can assist you." That evening, as darkness blanketed Rome, Hugh met with John May on the shadowy steps of St. Peter's Basilica. The streets were silent under the Nazi-imposed curfew, and the ominous presence of armed German paratroopers was impossible to ignore. "Look, Monsignor," May said, shaking his head. "This thing is too big for one man. You can't handle it alone, and it's barely begun. Oh, I know you've got every neutral Irish priest in Rome pitching in. Everyone knows that. And there are others, those Maltese, that big New Zealander, Father Snedden, isn't it? But Monsignor, with respect, they're only priests. They don't know their way around like I do, or like some of my friends do. And you needn't tell Sir Darcy too much. I'll handle the grub to start, and suggest we bring in Count Salazar to help." Hugh regarded the resourceful little man with a newfound respect. One thing was certain, this was just the beginning. Hugh O'Flaherty was born in 1898 in Cork, Ireland. But despite this, he always considered himself a proud Kerry man. It was there, amidst the rolling green Irish hills, that O'Flaherty was raised by a devoutly religious family. His father, James O'Flaherty, was a schoolmaster and a steward on the local estate, who instilled in O'Flaherty and his siblings a sense of duty and spiritual grounding. His mother was a homemaker and was a primary influence in teaching her children the core values of prayer, charity, and morality. To the O'Flahertys, religion was not just a private matter, but a way of life. He attended school at the Presentation Monastery in Killarney. He must have been an impressive student because he was asked to stay on as an assistant teacher. While he was there, he applied for and won a King's Scholarship to train as a national school teacher. But just before his final teacher training exams, he became very sick with an attack of pleurisy. Because he was ill and unable to take the exam, he did not qualify to become a national school teacher. But this trial proved a monumental switch point in his life, because it was likely during this illness that he came to realize his desire to become a priest. But finances were tight for the O'Flahertys, and letters from this time show Hugh's concern that pursuing a vocation in the church would place a heavy financial burden on his family. But when his father heard about Hugh's intentions, he responded, "I would sell the house to make a priest of him." With this assurance, O'Flaherty embarked on his path toward the priesthood. He attended the Mungret College in Limerick, where he actually excelled more in sports than he did academics. Golf, handball, swimming, and boxing were some of his favorite activities. And while he was known for his jovial and outgoing nature, he neither smoked nor drank. It was also while he was at college that he became a firm nationalist. 1919 to 1921 marked the Irish's War of Independence, when Ireland sought to separate themselves from the control of Britain. The year 1920 was the worst experienced by the Irish people in centuries. The British had recruited a group largely made up of British World War I veterans to suppress the Irish's war for independence. They were called the Black and Tans. Author J.P. Gallagher described the group this way: "This ignoble force included freed jailbirds and thugs of every description, undisciplined slaughterers, whose conduct led to the resignation of many British Army officers, ashamed of the atrocities that the Tans had committed." O'Flaherty came from a Republican family, meaning that they believed in the Irish's independence from Britain, but the events happening during his school years made those convictions run even deeper. After the Daily Mail brought news of more death, he and other Republican boys at his table pumped their fists in the air and cried out, "One day we'll sink the whole British Navy." Then O'Flaherty turned to his neighbor and said emphatically, "And the English called the Germans Huns during the war. It's a pity the Germans didn't win, and hang Lloyd George and the whole British cabinet from the lampposts of Whitehall." Fierce and even shocking words coming from a would-be priest. But this also gives us a glimpse of the unvarying sense of justice that existed within O'Flaherty even as a young man. As one acquaintance of O'Flaherty's recalled, he was, quote, "a man of character and determination, who was at the same time very gentle and hated to even see animals hurt." It also is amazing to take into account, considering that he would go on to save more British lives during World War II than any other individual. John Furman, who worked closely with O'Flaherty and his network, said this about his first meeting with the Irish priest. He stood about Sam's height, with a fine physique not much inferior to Sam's own. His face normally wore a benign, absent-minded, professorial expression, an effect which his spectacles heightened. But the mood could change very quickly, and I was frequently to see the kindly twinkle in his eyes displaced by flaming passion whenever he heard of some particularly bestial cruelty perpetuated no matter by whom or against whom. After completing his education at Munich, he went on to study at the Irish College in Rome. After he'd passed his examination and became a priest, he wrote to his sister saying, "It was a great day, and as usual, when I am happy and the Lord showers blessings on me, then instead of laughing and thanking him, I cry, which of course is Mother's weakness. The letters he wrote home during this period of his life give us great insight into who he was as a person. Biographer Brian Fleming wrote, "His correspondence home to a range of family members during these years highlights the characteristics and values which he brought to bear on his subsequent work. Particularly noteworthy are his humility, a gentle nature, care and concern for others, most particularly his parents, the strength of his vocation, a sense of humor, and a willingness to help anyone, whether relative, friend, or distant acquaintance who might be visiting Rome. In addition, of course, he kept his family up to date on his developing career and was always anxious to hear news of home." In the next several years, O'Flaherty obtained 3 doctorates in divinity, philosophy, and canon law, and was promoted to the rank of Monsignor, an impressive feat for someone still in his early 30s and very new in their career. He served in a number of missions around the world from Haiti to South Africa before being assigned to the holy offices in Rome. He eventually began working in the Vatican's Secretariat of State. He was deeply involved in the administrative and diplomatic workings of the Vatican when Mussolini rose to power, and of course the subsequent uniting of Italy and Germany under the Pact of Steel. During the early days of the war, tens of thousands of Allied prisoners were being held in Italian war camps, so the Pope assigned Bergoncini Duca, another Monsignor, to visit the prisoners and check on their welfare. But because Monsignor Duca did not speak English, O'Flaherty was recruited to accompany him and act as his secretary and interpreter. But it wasn't long before O'Flaherty took full command of the role. Whereas Duca would usually visit 1 camp per day, O'Flaherty, in his usual energetic fashion, approached the matter full-heartedly. He would regularly catch a train back to Rome at night with a list of names from the prisoners, to be promptly broadcast by the Vatican radio so their families could be alerted of their whereabouts. Then the next morning he'd ride the train back, arriving just in time for the next visit. He also went to great lengths, bending the rules at times, to make sure that the prisoners received packages from the Red Cross and campaigned to have doctors and Protestant chaplains sent to their camps. Eventually, the fascist authorities in Italy asked that the visits stop, and according to a letter from a British prisoner of war, quote, "The real reason was the importunity with which Monsignor O'Flaherty championed the cause of all Allied prisoners of war, persecuted Jews and anti-fascists and refugees, and thus disturbed the Italian fascists' conscience and policy towards these unfortunate people." A couple months later, after he made an informal visit to a prisoner of war camp for Australian and South African prisoners, the local fascist party reported to the authorities in Rome that the visit had raised the morale of the prisoners and lowered that of their guards. But everything changed after Italy's capitulation and the consequent seize of power by Germany. The Nazis, led by Colonel Herbert Kappler, SS officer placed in charge of the city, issued a decree targeting the Jewish population, demanding that the Jews pay 50 kilograms or about 110 pounds of gold within 36 hours as a ransom to avoid deportation to concentration camps. The Jews, with the help of the compassionate Roman community, including many non-Jewish Italians, managed to raise the amount in the time frame. But the Germans did not keep their promise. Not long after, Jews began being arrested by the hundreds and deported to Auschwitz and other concentration and extermination camps. At first, O'Flaherty was simply an observer of the conflict. He later told a friend, "When this war started, I used to listen to broadcasts from both sides, all propaganda, of course, and both making the same terrible charges against the other. I frankly didn't know which side to believe, until they started rounding up Jews in Rome. They treated them like beasts, making old men and respectable women get down on their knees and scrub the roads. You know the sort of thing that happened after that. It got worse and worse, and I knew then which side I had to believe." He began secretly hiding Jews and prisoners of war with sympathetic friends. It was the beginning of one of the most complex and significant underground resistance organizations in history. Led by a man who seemingly knew no fear, and everyone who engaged in his operation willingly placed themselves in great peril. Grim expressions etched the faces of the Italians as Hugh passed, each glance underscoring the reality that things were heating up. The Germans had tightened their grip, curfews were enforced, surveillance increased, and fear hung heavily in the air. With over 1,000 people in hiding, the risk was escalating every day. Sam Derry, an escaped British soldier, had recently joined their ranks. His arrival was nothing short of providential. With a background in military strategy and exceptional organization skills, Sam was sure to be an invaluable ally, easing some of the burden on Hugh's shoulders. At a recent gathering, Hugh had been approached by the German ambassador, von Weizsäcker, for a private word. The ambassador's grave expression still lingered in Hugh's memory as he delivered a chilling warning. The Germans know all about your illegal activities. Tonight I will ensure your safe return to the Vatican, but hear me. If you ever step outside Vatican territory again, on whatever pretext, you will be arrested at once. Despite the consequences one could foresee, that decision has been agreed in your case, and I cannot alter it. Now will you please think about what I have said? Hugh hadn't been overly concerned about the warning. After all, John May had been cautioning him for months to stop taking risks, ignoring the fact that, as a British citizen, John himself was at a constant risk of arrest. At least Hugh, as an Irishman from a neutral country, had the shield of diplomatic immunity. Regardless, there was work to be done, and it couldn't be accomplished within the confines of the Vatican walls. Hugh made his way to the Palazzo Doria, home of the Prince Filippo Doria Pamphili. The prince, another godsend at the perfect time, had provided vital funds to sustain the operation. Yet the money disappeared all too quickly, as food was growing scarcer and prices soaring. Climbing the white marble stairs to the third floor, Hugh entered a room where Prince Filippo, his secretary, and another wealthy Roman ally were waiting. The discussion quickly turned to the operation's financial needs and potential sources of additional support. Prince Filippo pulled an envelope from his pocket, saying, "Here is 300 lire to be going on with, and we are organizing a little collection among our friends. Your friends," he added. "There's nothing to worry about. We won't let you down." "Oh yes, there's something to worry about," interrupted the secretary, who had been glancing out the window at the street below. "Look here." The three men rushed to their feet, crowding around the window to see what was happening. On each side of the palazzo, the street had been blocked by SS troops. From a black sedan emerged the infamous and hated Colonel Kappler himself. It was clear that Kappler had kept a watch on the place, just waiting for the possibility of Hugh making an appearance. Just then a servant came running into the room, panting as he declared that the Germans had completely surrounded the palazzo and were thronging the courtyard to one side of the building. Prince Filippo wore an expression of great distress as he murmured, "I'm afraid this is it, Hugh. There is no point to resisting. There is no way to escape this time." "Don't you believe it," Hugh shot back. "Give me that money." "Thanks," he said as he shoved it in his pocket. "We'd better find some other place to meet next time. I mustn't compromise you. If the Germans don't find me here, they can't prove that I was here. Bye," he threw over his shoulder. "God bless you." And with that, Hugh fled from the room, nearly flying down the staircase in the main hall, passing by half a dozen of the prince's servants, who nervously waited to open the door that the SS officers were loudly banging on for entry. "Don't open it for a bit longer," Hugh instructed in a fierce whisper as he dashed to the back of the hall where he found a steep, narrow staircase leading down to the cellars. When he reached the bottom, he glanced around, his thoughts racing for his options of escape. There was no doubt that the Germans would tear the place apart if necessary to find him. No hiding place would be sufficient. For a split second, he wondered if he'd inadvertently cornered himself. He began cautiously walking down the passage leading to the cellars. Then, he abruptly stopped, his ears peaked. Mixed with the muffled sounds of German troops in the building above him, he detected something else, a strange noise like rocks rolling down a mountainside. As he moved forward, a patch of light poured from one of the cellars opening off the passage. Hugh rushed forward to inspect, and was amazed to see that Prince Filippo was in the process of receiving his winter fuel supply of coal. Coal was sliding down a small incline leading to an open trapdoor in the courtyard. Hugh began clambering up the mountain of shifting coal, expecting a sackful to come pouring down on his head at any moment, but none came. When he reached the top, he ever so carefully peered out and saw two coalmen standing by their truck parked outside the courtyard gates, as a number of SS officers stood in two stiff lines across the yard. Thankfully, none of them were looking his direction. Then he noticed an empty coal sack lying on the ground not too far away. He dared to raise himself a little higher, reaching out to grab hold of the sack. Sliding back down the coal chute, he tore off his black cassock and stuffed it and his hat into the sack. He topped it off with some coal, and then rubbed the coal dust into his hair and smeared it on his face. Ripping his gray collarless shirt down to his waist, he did the same to his chest before scrambling back up to the trapdoor. Just as Hugh reached the top of the coal chute, he heard a German voice shout in halting Italian, "You men, hurry on with your work and get out of here." Hugh froze as one of the coalmen moved toward the trapdoor, carrying a bag of coal. Thinking quickly, Hugh whispered, "Hold it. Stay exactly as you are and listen. I'm a priest. The Gestapo are after me. Leave that sack on the side there and come down here a moment." The coalman hesitated, but then, with a small gasp of surprise, he placed the sack on one side and slid down the chute to join Hugh. He landed awkwardly, looking at Hugh with a mix of shock and curiosity. "A new assistant I have, eh?" he quipped. "There's no time to waste," Hugh responded. "I need you to stay here for just a minute or two, no more. As soon as I've gone through the gates, you can come out and get on with the delivery." "Right, father," the coalman replied, nodding in agreement. "But don't let Marco, my mate, see your face. He's so dumb he might give you away." Hugh allowed himself a brief smile of gratitude before hoisting the coal sack over his shoulder. He climbed back up the chute and carefully emerged into the courtyard. As he approached the SS officers, his heart pounded. They stood stiffly, in two lines, eyes fixed ahead. Hugh kept his head down, walking briskly. The sack slung over his shoulder helped mask his features, and the coal dust covering his face and body completed the disguise. The officer in charge waved him through without a second glance. The distasteful expressions of the SS men, unwilling to dirty their uniforms by brushing against him, were a silent blessing. Hugh moved steadily forward, his footsteps echoing faintly in the tense silence of the courtyard. As he passed through the gates, he forced himself to maintain a steady pace. Only when he turned the corner into an empty street did he allow himself a deep breath of relief. Pausing for a moment, Hugh dumped the coal sack and retrieved his cassock from within. With his robes tucked under his arm, he sprinted toward the nearest church. Inside, the sacristan gaped at his appearance, but generously provided a place for him to wash and dress back into his priestly apparel. Several hours later, Hugh picked up the phone and called Prince Filippo to inform him of his safety. "Someday you must tell me how you did it," the prince said with evident relief. "I'm afraid Colonel Kapler is a very angry man. He spent 2 hours here, and did say that if I happened to see you, I was to say that one of these days he would be entertaining you in Vietasso." Hugh grimaced. Vietasso, the Gestapo's headquarters in Rome, was infamous for torture and imprisonment. The weight of Kapler's words hung heavily in his mind. Perhaps it was time to be a little more cautious. But deep down Hugh knew caution alone wouldn't be enough to stop him. There was too much at stake, and as long as people needed him, he would continue to fight, whatever the cost. What's truly remarkable about the network O'Flaherty started was the diversity of people who worked alongside him. From manservant John May, who O'Flaherty described as, quote, indispensable, a genius, and the most magnificent scrounger I ever came across. The butler did have a particular skill in using the black market, and had a wide range of contacts that kept him informed about what was happening on the streets. But there were also Italian elites, like Prince Filippo, who supplied massive amounts of funds, and Princess Nina, a Russian duchess with ties to the Romanov family, who married an Italian prince. She contributed by offering shelter to fugitives in her own properties, but she was especially masterful at forging documents, which allowed escapees to move about Rome and get past German checkpoints. She, like many others, was driven by her humanity and the Christian values with which she had been raised. And she was only one of many remarkably courageous women who joined their ranks. Henrietta Chevalier was another example. The 5'4" tall Maltese widow was raising her large family of 6, 5 daughters and 1 son, when she began hiding escapees in her home. She laid mattresses on her apartment floor, and day in and day out she looked after her boys, as she called them. Several times she received warning just before an SS search was made of her apartment. John Furman said this of Mrs. Chevalier: "What can be said of this incredible woman, who I guess to be in her early 40s? I would not call her brave, for it seemed to me that she had no conception of fear. Her kindness and generosity were unparalleled, her maternal spirit and compassion boundless. During my stay in Rome, some scores of Allied prisoners must have received hospitality in her home." Another timely helper was Delia Murphy, wife of the Irish minister in the Vatican. While her husband was bound by the neutrality of his position, Delia and their daughter were active supporters of O'Flaherty's operation. While trying to decide whether or not to get involved, Delia explains, quote, "For a time I wrestled with my conscience and prayed for guidance about what I should do to help Father O'Flaherty. A voice inside me said charity was something God intended for all humanity, in war and peace. I remembered the words of St. Paul, 'Now abideth faith, hope, and charity, these 3. The greatest of these is charity.' What else could it be but charity to help those in trouble with the Nazis? During the 9-month occupation of Rome, the Germans had splashed posters warning that anyone found sheltering an Allied prisoner of war would be shot. I doubt if they would have shot the wife of the Irish minister, but they might not have hesitated with others in our group. I made sure none of the high-ranking German warlords who invited the Kiernans to their feasts ever suspected what an Irish woman in Rome was doing in her spare time." Sam Derry, a young English major, became another key asset. It's actually from Sam Derry's autobiography that we learn a lot of the details about the operation, since O'Flaherty himself never recorded his experiences. It was Derry that became in charge of the organizational details, and between he and O'Flaherty, he was certainly the more cautious of the two. Derry said, "The Monsignor, needless to say, welcomed every new arrival with cheerful enthusiasm, and paid no attention to my repeated protests that he was putting himself in danger." But even O'Flaherty, after his coal chute incident, realized that he needed to be more careful on the streets of Rome. Were the Germans to catch him across that white line, he certainly would be captured, tortured, and executed. So he came up with a simple solution to his problem. If he couldn't be recognized, he couldn't be arrested. He began wearing a variety of disguises, from a street cleaner to a repairman, and one claim even suggests that he dressed up as a nun on one occasion. It's for this reason that he gained the nickname the Pimpernel of the Vatican. But things continued getting worse and worse in Rome. The Germans' choking hold grew tighter by the day, and their desperation to seize O'Flaherty and crush his network continued to increase. And as things became more precarious, they started using code names for added protection. The network came to be known on London records as the British Escape Organization. Still, several of their team members were captured, interrogated by torture, and even executed. Indeed, every person who became involved with the escape network was putting themselves at great risk. And they very well knew that they might meet the same fate. As Brian Fleming wrote, "Anyone harboring escaped prisoners of war, owning a wireless transmitter, or not fulfilling labor obligations would be immediately executed. Anyone in contact with escaped prisoners of war, printing or publishing news derogatory to the Axis forces, assisting with the operation of a wireless, or taking photographs out of doors, would be sentenced to hard labor for life. A 20-year prison sentence would apply to anyone who failed to notify the authorities of a change of address. On the afternoon of March 23rd, a resistance movement from the Italians resulted in the death of 32 members of the German police force. Punishment for this was swift. The German High Command ordered that for every German that was killed, 10 Italians would be executed. 3 days later, the executions took place in a cave outside of Rome. 5 of those killed were personal friends of O'Flaherty's and integral members of his underground network. That was truly a tragic day in Rome. As food grew more scarce and the situation ever more dire, the only hope the Italians felt was in the approach of the Allied armies, who were getting closer and closer to Rome. Mother Mary, a nun who helped O'Flaherty, but who also recorded many of the events during the Nazis' occupation, put it this way: "The offensive of the Allies has put new life into us and new hope into the Italians. The Allies are progressing slowly, but as long as they do progress, all is well." The Italians had hoped that it would come quickly, but the months dragged by. By June of 1944, O'Flaherty's network was hiding over 6,500 people, waiting painfully for the Germans to be driven from the city. Mother Mary wrote, "Every day we expect the invasion. Every day we listen to victory talk on the wireless. Every day we notice growing tension around us, and ill-concealed hopes of the arrival of the Allies. When will they come?" She goes on to write, "A fresh rumor, optimistic this time, says insistently that the Pope has promised the Germans that if they do not damage the city as they withdraw, he will make himself responsible for all their wounded whom they might leave behind. Reports as to the number of wounded vary between 20,000 and 40,000. We are immensely cheered by the news, broadcast from Anzio, that the Allies are bringing to Rome foodstuffs of every kind except flour and oil. Lack of food has had an alarming slimming effect on everyone in Rome. Not only the poor, but on the man in the street and one's friends. It gives one a heartache to see it. No longer is it complimentary to allude the loss of weight. On the contrary, the subject is tactfully avoided." But finally, the Allied troops did arrive, releasing the tyrannical chokehold on Rome and setting her free. John stood at the edge of the cobbled street, watching as the Allied jeeps and tanks rumbled through the ancient city gates. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street. The air was thick with dust, stirred up by the rumbling wheels, and mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of gunfire lingering in the aftermath of battle. The tumult and shouting had died around 1 a.m., and the scene of the Allies' entrance was dramatic in its simplicity. The first little jeep had arrived around 6 o'clock, with 4 American soldiers in it, making its way slowly and soundlessly down the street. No one else had been around. The thing had looked so solitary yet so significant in the cool stillness of dawn. It was a beautiful vignette on the page of history, a full stop at the end of the chapter of oppression and fear. People had poured from their homes, and now Italians lined the sidewalks, their faces painted with hope. They were waving makeshift flags, torn sheets, tattered shirts, anything to celebrate the moment. Children darted through the legs of adults, their laughter high-pitched and infectious. John didn't think he'd seen so much laughter since the beginning of the war. Women wept openly, their hands pressed to rosaries, eyes glistening with tears of relief and gratitude. This was the liberation that they had waited for, the end of the occupation, the dawn of a new day. An elderly man stepped forward, his eyes brimming with tears, and embraced one of the American soldiers. "Grazie, grazie," he sobbed, his voice cracking with emotion. Nearby, a woman dropped to her knees, her hands raised to the sky. John stood there, watching the scene with some amazement. The city he had called home for the past year seemed to be breathing again, exhaling the tension that had gripped it for so long. The streets were alive with celebration. a spontaneous party of sorts, as if the people were making up for lost time, sharing food, wine, and stories of survival. The population seemed to have doubled, as thousands of Jews, POWs, and anti-fascists emerged from their hiding places to celebrate their freedom. The Allied soldiers seemed to understand the importance of this moment. They were not just liberators, they were participants in a shared victory. One soldier hoisted a young girl onto his shoulders, and she waved a tattered flag with unbridled enthusiasm. The soldier smiled up at her, a rare, genuine smile that spoke of relief and hope. It was a small but powerful gesture, one that underscored the humanity of this moment, one of connection amidst the destruction. John turned to look at the tanks as they continued their slow, steady progress through the city. He approached one jeep, reaching out to shake hands with the driver to congratulate him on the success of the Fifth Army. "Say," the man responded in surprise, "you speak good English for an Italiano." John smiled, "Perhaps because I am English." The man looked at John, amazed. "Well, what do you know? Say, what are you doing here anyway?" John thought for a moment. It was an apt question. What was he doing here? He'd leapt from a train, for goodness sake, and just a couple of miles from the Swiss border and freedom. Yet he'd chosen to cycle 400 or so miles to return to Rome and rejoin O'Flaherty's organization. Why had he done that? Why was he not at home with his wife, playing with the 2-year-old daughter that he'd never seen? Why were they all here? Why had the world gone mad? John suddenly felt tired, and in no mood to answer the philosophical question. He slapped the driver on the back. "Just playing a game," he said. "A game of hide and seek. But it's all over now." As he turned away, he heard the driver lean across to his friend and mutter, "That guy's crazy, playing hide and seek." Beside him, a group of Italians began to sing, a ragged but jubilant chorus of Bella Ciao, the anthem of the Italian resistance. The soldiers joined in, their voices rough but harmonious. It was a strange, beautiful moment, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be light, and that freedom was worth fighting for. At the end of World War II, O'Flaherty was recognized and honored by the British government, the United States, Italy, Canada, and Australia, among others, for his courageous efforts. Time and time again, he risked his life, miraculously escaping capture on multiple occasions. He is credited with saving over 6,500 lives, sparing them from imprisonment, horrific conditions, and death. That's more than 5 times the amount of Oskar Schindler, and more than any other individual during World War II. And what makes his story even more remarkable is when you learn that among those who found their way to safety through his organization were the families of his enemies. And I'm not talking about the British here, I'm talking about the Germans, among which was Herbert Kappler's wife and children. Because when the Allies came in and took over Rome, many of the German officers were not able to flee and were arrested. Little did Kappler realize, when he was working so hard to capture the elusive Pimpernel, that the network he sought to destroy would save the lives of his family. Kappler himself was tried and sentenced to life in prison for war crimes. In all the time he spent in prison, he received only one visitor. Every month, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty came to see him. In a strange turn of fate, the two men became friends, and eventually Kappler was baptized at the hand of the priest. When 2 fascist collaborators came on trial, who were also alleged double agents, O'Flaherty testified on their behalf. As he explained to Derry later, they did wrong, but there is good in every man. What a remarkable example of loving your enemies. Somehow he was able to see past the distinctions of nationality and see people simply as children of a great God who loves them. O'Flaherty's humanity truly knew no bounds or boundaries. When questioned by friends as to why he was helping people on the other side, His response was simple but profound. God has no country. Veronica Doone, who O'Flaherty acted as a guardian for while she was studying in Rome after the war, said, "They treated him like a god. Not just the Romans, but the American, British, and French soldiers also. When people who he had helped reached out to him asking to repay him somehow, O'Flaherty would invariably ask that they send clothes to help an impoverished congregation that he'd become aware of. It was said that after neglecting himself so heavily for the sake of others, his palate could no longer handle rich foods. Billy Vincent, who'd been recovering from a war wound at the hospital in Rome, wanted to repay the kindness that O'Flaherty had showed him. He wrote, "I wanted to give him a present, and did not know what he would like. I asked him, and he said, 'I would like a pair of army boots like you have if you could get them.' I looked at his shoes, and they seemed to be all right, and then he lifted up his foot, and there were hardly any soles on his shoes. He had been walking all over Rome during the war, with really only the uppers of his shoes. I was amazed. I would never have thought he had suffered in this way. So naturally, I got a pair of army boots for him, and he was delighted." And the Duchess of Sermonetta adds this of O'Flaherty: "A large volume could be filled with stories of thrilling adventures in which his life was constantly in danger. I know how he gave away practically all the clothes he possessed, except those he stood up in, and that night after night he slept on the floor so that an exhausted man could rest in his bed. But the trouble is that he will not let me write about his own activities, and persists in telling me only what other people did. I could give you countless examples of acts of kindness and service that O'Flaherty gave after the war, but suffice it to say that he spent his entire life in the service of others, and consistently neglected himself in that pursuit. I feel that his example is especially poignant in this time of division and contention. One of the devil's greatest victories comes when he can turn us against each other. I will never comprehend man's inhumanity to man. History is full of it, but there are also examples like that of an Irish priest, who in one of the most divided periods of history was able to see past all of that and recognize those around him as his brothers and sisters. As O'Flaherty pointed out, God has no country. We all come from a good and great God that made us in his image and loved us enough to send his Son to redeem us. That is the message of Christianity. It is the most inclusive and uniting message that you will ever find. Too much unkindness and cruelty is justified on the idea that someone else stood on the opposite side of an issue or cause. It simply does not. We might not agree with everyone, but we must not lose sight of the fact that we are all in reality on the same side, fighting against a common enemy, even the enemy of all that is good. This episode will be coming out during the Christmas season, and I can think of no better time to recommit ourselves to follow after the Prince of Peace. Because at the end of the world, when the history books are opened, they will not tell the story of nations, but the story of a family, Adam and Eve's family, whose origins are divine and whose destiny is glorious. So when we feel inclined to hurt or malign another soul, I hope we can pause and remember that Father is watching, and oh, how it must rend his soul to see us fight. If we can only remember that, maybe there really would be peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Because this message has the power to unite our world, and it has the power to ignite our faith.